Sedona, Arizona, 2009. The heat inside the sweat lodge was unlike anything the participants had ever experienced. Packed tightly into the low dome structure, dozens of people knelt shoulder to shoulder as steam filled the air, thick enough to blur their vision and choke their lungs. They had come seeking spiritual enlightenment, believing that this ritual, sold to them as a pathway to rebirth, would purify their bodies and awaken their souls. But this was no traditional Native American ceremony. It was a dangerous, improvised version led by a self-help guru who pushed his followers to endure suffering as a form of transformation. Rocks heated to blistering temperatures were shoveled into the pit at the center of the lodge, and water was poured over them, releasing waves of scalding steam. The temperature soared past 90 degrees Celsius. Several participants began vomiting, their bodies overwhelmed by the heat. Others collapsed, drifting in and out of consciousness. But instead of stopping the ritual, the leader urged them to go beyond the physical, insisting that pain was merely weakness leaving the body. As minutes stretched into an hour, the atmosphere grew more suffocating. Survivors later recounted the terror of trying and failing to draw in a full breath. Some crawled toward the entrance in a desperate attempt to escape, only to be told to stay inside and finish the ritual. When the lodge finally opened, 3 people were already unresponsive, their bodies limp and burnt from the extreme heat. 18 more were rushed to the hospital. Investigators later described the scene as a preventable mass casualty event. The leader was convicted of negligent homicide, but the deeper tragedy lay in the blind trust that had brought ordinary people into a ritual that was never safe to begin with. B.A., Fiji, 1956. The firewalking ceremony had always been a source of pride among the Sawa people of Fiji. For centuries, the ritual had been performed with discipline, precision, and deep respect for ancestral rules. Only trained members of specific clans were permitted to participate, and only after a series of strict preparations designed to protect them from harm. But in 1956, the ceremony was rushed and altered, performed not for spiritual purpose but to entertain visiting dignitaries. The stones used in the ritual pit were heated far beyond the usual limit, and more importantly, they had not been allowed to cool as tradition required. The men chosen to perform were not all properly prepared. Some had skipped the traditional fasting and abstinence period, while others had not performed the necessary pre-ritual cleansing believed to protect them from burns. Still, the show went on. As the performers stepped onto the glowing rocks, bystanders heard their cries almost instantly. Cries never heard in a ritual that usually relied on silence and discipline. One man collapsed within seconds, the skin on his feet split open from the intense heat. Another stumbled into the pit, his clothing catching fire. Chaos erupted as spectators tried to intervene, but the heat was too intense. By the time the injuries were treated, 2 performers had died from severe burns and infection. What should have been a sacred demonstration of cultural heritage became a national tragedy, serving as a stark reminder that rituals cannot be rushed or modified without consequences. The Sawa elders declared that the ritual would never again be performed without full adherence to ancient protocols. Kreuzberg, Germany, 1976. When the priests began the exorcism sessions, they believed they were doing what the church had permitted. The young woman, Anneliese Michiel, had been struggling with severe psychological symptoms for years: hallucinations, convulsions, episodes of self-harm. But instead of continuous medical treatment, her parents turned to spiritual intervention, convinced that her suffering was not rooted in illness but in possession. Over the next 10 months, 67 ritual sessions were conducted. Each one involved hours of prayer, shouting, physical restraint, and forced postures intended to break the demon's control. Annalisa, already frail, was pushed to fast as part of the ritual purification. Her body weakened rapidly. She dropped to a skeletal weight. She lost the ability to stand without assistance. Yet the rituals continued, each session more intense than the last. Witnesses later described her voice changing, her movements rigid and unnatural, but medical experts argued these were manifestations of extreme physical and mental distress, not demonic influence. By the summer of 1976, Annalise could no longer eat or drink. Her parents insisted she refused food voluntarily as part of the ritual, but in truth, she was too weak to function. On July 1st, she died from starvation and dehydration. Her death ignited one of Germany's most controversial trials. The priests and parents were charged with negligent homicide. The court concluded that the exorcism rituals had replaced essential medical care, leading directly to her death. Annalise's story became a striking example of how ritualistic belief can override rational intervention, even in modern society. Chimaltenango, Guatemala, 2012. In the highlands of Guatemala, traditional Mayan ceremonies continue to weave through daily life. Many involve smoke and fire, used symbolically to cleanse the spirit and create a bridge to ancestors. For one young woman seeking emotional healing, the ceremony was supposed to be a moment of renewal. She entrusted her well-being to a local shaman who claimed deep ancestral knowledge, but who, as later investigations showed, lacked proper training. The ritual required the woman to stand within a circle of burning herbs and resins that produced thick clouds of aromatic smoke. Under normal circumstances, the smoke remains dissipated. But on this particular day, the shaman miscalculated the amount of resin needed. Instead of a thin veil of smoke, a dense, choking plume poured upward, engulfing the circle in seconds. Witnesses said the woman began coughing violently, stumbling as she tried to escape the smoke-filled ring. But her long robe caught fire from a nearby ember, and panic erupted. People rushed in with blankets, trying desperately to smother the flames, but the fire spread too quickly. By the time they pulled her away, she had suffered fatal burns and severe smoke inhalation. She died before reaching the hospital. The incident devastated the community. Elders stated publicly that the ritual had been conducted incorrectly and dangerously, violating key safety practices. What should have been a gentle ceremony of purification instead became a catastrophic misunderstanding of ancient procedure. A reminder that rituals passed down informally can become deadly when vital knowledge is lost. ASUOGYAMAN, 2015. The drums echoed across the clearing, their rhythm synchronizing with the dancers' movements. The ritual was meant to summon protective spirits, bringing good fortune to the village. Participants danced vigorously, entering rhythmic trances guided by tradition. But one dancer, a young man known for his devotion, began pushing himself far beyond the usual limits. Witnesses recalled his movements growing erratic, his breathing sharp and shallow. But instead of stopping him, observers believed his behavior signaled a deeper spiritual connection. His collapse was interpreted as a transition into a spiritual state, a moment when ancestors were believed to speak through the body. Minutes passed before anyone recognized that something was wrong. When ritual leaders approached, they found him unresponsive, his pulse dangerously faint. Panic spread. The drumming stopped. Attempts were made to revive him, but it was too late. He died shortly afterward. The autopsy revealed cardiac arrest triggered by extreme physical exertion and dehydration. The delay in intervention sealed his fate. Medical experts pointed out that had he been treated within minutes, he likely would have survived. Instead, the ritual context led observers to misinterpret medical distress as spiritual transformation. This death became a turning point, prompting regional leaders to implement safety guidelines for physically intense ceremonies. KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, 2018. The river flowed quietly under the afternoon sun, unaware of the tragedy about to unfold on its banks. A group of believers had gathered for a cleansing ritual, one meant to wash away misfortune and open the path to prosperity. The ceremony involved immersion in the river, symbolic, brief, controlled. But on this day, emotions ran high. One participant claimed he felt a dark presence resisting the ritual, insisting the spirit did not want to leave his body. The group became increasingly agitated. Panic mingled with superstition. Convinced that the spirit needed to be forced out, several participants held the man underwater, shouting prayers and commands. They believed that submerging him longer would break the entity's hold. Moments turned into minutes. When they finally released him, his body floated unnaturally still. Realizing too late what had happened, they tried desperately to revive him, performing improvised resuscitation techniques. Nothing worked. Police later ruled the case a ritual murder, and several individuals were arrested. Investigators emphasized that the victim had drowned after prolonged, forced submersion, a fatal misunderstanding fueled by fear and superstition. This incident added to a disturbing pattern of ritual-related deaths in the region, prompting authorities to issue public warnings about ritual practices that involve physical restraint or immersion.